Hello.
How is everyone doing today?
Good. Thanks.
Good, good,
How's it on your side?
good. Thanks. Yeah, good to connect with you. How have you found the materials we've been sending so far?
So far, so good. It's quite a mouthful, and trying to get it to fit into my head. And yes, I'm enjoying the materials.
Okay, great. You're finding it when you say it's difficult to fit into your head. What is the biggest challenge?
It's finding the story that is going to be able to sustain the whole 7 episodes. So I'm trying to get it to work, trying to see what can work and what cannot work.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. So you're kind of sort of struggling with, like we were talking about yesterday, this idea of a story that isn't just maybe 200 words or 2000 words, but this idea that it can kind of fit over many episodes, essentially.
Yes. And revealing bit by bit, so that you don't exhaust and lose the interest of the audience on a single episode. So it's quite interesting actually to try to think of something that can be that much captivating.
Yeah, because you can have like stories that are very important, but they don't necessarily fill that criteria, right?
Yes.
Okay.
That's true.
And do you have anything in mind at the moment?
Moment, I have quite a few ideas that I would like to work on, but I haven't yet gone deeper to really set it down to close it on one particular store. But I'm looking at issues around migration, especially in South Africa, the health aspect, the social belonging, and the community aspect that many migrant communities find themselves there.
Okay, so issues around migration. Okay, that sounds good. That sounds really good. How about you, Precious? How have you found finding a story that will fit into this kind of format?
Yes, I have.
She's just on the Zoom call, but maybe she'll come in a minute.
Yeah, I have.
Okay,
I
well,
have. Can you
I
hear
just
me?
wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the writing side of things, like because today we were talking about like writing and story structure, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about how people need to write like very clearly, right? So basically, I think that's the key. Like you want clear writing, and you often need, if people have been in broadcast before, like often you need to go over your script several times to make sure that you're easily understood. Because the thing about, even though we're talking about having all the space and multiple episodes, people also have very little, they have high attention spans, I believe, but only if you manage to hold their attention. Like that's the kind of tension there, is that and you can lose their attention very easily. So if you have a paragraph of writing that's very confusing, you can kind of lose your audience and they won't necessarily come back, right? They might still listen for a little while, but they definitely won't necessarily move to like another episode. Oh, just give me 1 second. I just need to open the gate. Just give me 1 second.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so basically you need to kind of have this sense of being able to hold people's attention really clearly. And you can do that by making sure things are presented in a way of questions and answers. And I don't necessarily mean that in a very overt way, in terms of you don't have to ask the question, but in your scripting, you need to have the sense that like your story is asking a question, maybe about society or about a country or about a theme in a country. And ultimately your listeners, if you think about, or readers or viewers in other types of journalism, are really kind of engaging with your content to kind of answer that question. Now, if you break that down into smaller questions all the time in terms of storytelling, that's what people are staying with your content for, right? So basically you might ask a question like that a character in your story needs answering, and you and then you answer that. But then while people are waiting for that to be answered, they're very gripped. They want to know what the answer to that question is. So the sort of old, sort of classic example of that is that people, you mention a man who wakes up and he thinks, why is this house so quiet? And you don't know anything about the man, you don't know anything about the house, but now all of a sudden, you know, there's a character in there who's suspicious about why the house is so quiet. So maybe, you haven't said this, but maybe the house is usually full of children. Maybe it's full of life and movement. And now all of a sudden he's woken up and it's quiet. So really, just by saying those two lines, like a man wakes up and he wonders why it's so quiet, as a listener, you immediately want to know why it's so quiet. You don't know anything else. You don't know any story, but just with that economy of words of those two lines, immediately you've created a question. You've created a question that you want answered, right? And there could be millions of reasons why it's so quiet. Okay. And this is obviously a very simple example. It's not something that we want to tell that story, but it's a good example in kind of like thinking about how to hold people's attention and how to pull people through your story. So maybe a big question in a sort of a typical sort of journalistic investigation is maybe maybe there is something around like, did a man commit a crime, right? Is he guilty or innocent? Like we've all heard series like that. Like, is he guilty or is he innocent? And you want that question answered, but you don't have that question posed every second of the series. That question hangs over every episode, right? It hangs over every minute of every episode. But now you need to kind of dial it back to just these micro questions. So it's almost like, did he buy a gun in a shop, right? Where someone might have said he bought a gun. Now, did he buy that gun or did he not buy that gun? So, I mean, these are kind of cliched examples, and hopefully, I'm sure with everyone's story, they won't be as cliched, but you want to start thinking around like bigger questions around that are going to hold the whole story together, that people are going to want answered. It's all about like wanting an answer. And the reason why they're staying with your content or your podcast is because that you are promising them that you're going to answer these questions. And I think that's, and you can change what these questions are. It's up to you. You don't want to make big promises that, like, the old expression, you don't want checks you can't cash, basically, right? So you don't want questions that you can't answer, essentially. And as the journalist, as the creator of the content, you can change that. You can adjust the questions. You don't want to kind of swing for the fences in that way, and then you finish the series and you publish the series and you haven't answered any of the questions that you posed out. I will say that as a caveat, there is a sense of like, sometimes it's okay, and you'll know this instinctively as a journalist, it's okay to sometimes ask big questions, which everyone knows are impossible to answer, right? Like maybe if you're doing, to stick with the criminal justice, like wrongful conviction example, sometimes there are like big questions about the criminal justice system that people kind of know you're not going to be able to answer in a podcast series about, like, the massive corruption within the police in the whole country, right? Something big, something kind of immovable. And it's not like you can't talk about those topics if you don't have an answer to how to solve them or anything like that. I'm not saying that, but like within your world, and I like to think of things as like having their own working world within your characters and within what you're setting up. You want to have something that's satisfying. And I think that word satisfying is as I was talking about yesterday, something that's kind of new to introduce into journalism. It's almost like we're not used to thinking of we're used to journalism being factual, and all these series are still factual, and we're used to them being informative in a way that now we can tell other people perhaps about this information, and now we've learned something. But this idea of them being satisfying, I think, is quite a new idea. It's something that's sort of been in documentary films for years, but now we're increasingly introducing that into audio and into other kinds of journalism. And it's a difficult concept. It's a difficult concept to know. Like, you can watch a big budget film, right? And you might just leave unsatisfied in terms of how it ended and how everything kind of came together. So it's not something that you can teach it. And I'm, I guess the whole point of this is to try and teach it. But at the same time, it's not always easy to spot. And you can execute something and create a whole series, and some people might walk away being like, that was very satisfying in terms of how it ended, in terms of the questions that you posed and how you answered them, and other people might just be like, that was not satisfying for me, it did not work for me. You hear people say that about podcast series, you hear that about increasingly about journalism, and especially about films. So I think in your writing, you want this sense of drama, you want this sense of like in the materials today, I was like trying to say, think dramatically, think about transitions, think about like a kind of logic that moves one scene to another, right? So you're trying to think about that, but then you're also thinking about structure. And you need to think about this idea as a beginning, middle, and end. And you need to think about that on a grand scale in terms of like your episodes, like you set up your characters, you set up your idea, you have a middle, and then you have a conclusion. And the more you kind of bring that sense of structure to what you do, the better. So if you can do that to one episode, that's also good. This idea of like, you set up the ideas or the struggle really for that episode. You face adversity and overcome that, and then you conclude. And also there's something else around this idea of structure, in that you want the stakes to get higher. And by stakes is this sense of like what your main characters are facing and what they will lose if they don't succeed, right? So that sounds strange when you're thinking about something in journalism, and maybe your main character is you. Maybe your main character is the journalist who's trying to solve these cases, and that's also fine. But it kind of helps if that's the route you're taking, if there's an increasing sense of investment in terms of the journalist trying to solve the story or the case, or try and get to the bottom of what is going on, and he or she will lose something if they don't solve that case. And I think the more you can kind of push for that, the more you can kind of lean on that, the better. And you don't have to make, you definitely shouldn't make the stakes up. You shouldn't I think there is a tendency now, especially in these sort of dramatic podcasts, for journalists to kind of really overemphasize what they will lose if they don't manage to solve the case or get to the bottom of the story. And I think that's, first of all, it's like completely immoral as a journalist to lie, but also it's not necessary. You don't need to overly, your audience isn't stupid. They also know that you're not going to necessarily lose your job and be out on the street or whatever if you don't manage to finish this story, right? You don't need to overdo that. But there can be an emotional component for you as a journalist. And I'd like to hear what you guys think in terms of that, because that is also goes against sort of the old traditional idea of a journalist being unemotional, being not invested in the story, right? And that's the sort of old school BBC idea of journalism, which is increasingly fallen out of fashion. And I think podcasting has really pushed that falling out of fashion to like the next level, if you like. Okay, so I'm just going to pause there and just ask if you guys have any questions, if you have anything that you want to say or comment on before I go a bit further. Okay. So there are a few things in terms of, I've talked a little bit about structure, and there's a few other things around how you go about ordering your story. And I think that can be very confusing, especially if you've been doing an investigation for a very long time and you've got all sorts of interviews and bits of story and stuff like that. And you might have a sort of idea of how to do that in print. You might have a sort of set idea, but the way you're going to do that in audio can maybe seem a little bit daunting if you haven't done it before. And I think often the advice that I give is to do it chronologically. And I mean that, like, start at the beginning, end at the end. And that can seem a bit too basic, I think, for some people, especially in print, when you're often taught to start with the most exciting part, you know, like what they say in media res is like the old school idea. And then you kind of build your story backwards from this like opening scene. And you can definitely do that in audio. You can definitely, I'm not saying you shouldn't start with something that's interesting, but at the same time, like, I'm always surprised when I play audio for people, and you should definitely do this, right? Like when you've cut some audio together and then you play it for people, you can get people to read your scripts, but like that will be kind of different because people will never read your audio, right? They're not like the people, the end product isn't ever going to be read. So sure, people can read your scripts and comment on them and stuff like that. But in terms of clarity, it's often not actually beneficial because people can actually understand a script that you give them to read, and then you can convert it into audio, and then people get lost just in that process of it becoming audio. So it can often help to do a rough cut and to do some like dummy voiceover. I just do dummy voiceover like on my phone, basically, and then edit it together roughly and send it to people, because I find that then you can get a sense of if they can understand what's going on. And I'm always surprised, especially because if you know a story really well and you've been kind of living with it for so long, when you then play it for someone, if you don't tell a story in chronological order, if you don't start at the beginning and finish at the end in that way, often people get very confused. They're like, yeah, but I thought that guy was there. Why is there? And even though you go back and you're like, well, I explained, you know, in your voiceover, you explained important points. Sometimes they just do not sink in on some people. I remember I did a series years ago, where we talked about basically someone being inside prison, and they'd been in there for a lot of years. And the way that I found out about this man in prison was through this other woman who had a husband who was also in jail, right? And the husband knew the person who became the main character in this series. So it's a little bit convoluted. At the time, I didn't think it was convoluted. I thought it was actually very interesting in that sense of like, okay, cool, you've got this main character, and now the way you get to this main character is through this woman, and it's through this woman who's then married to this person who's inside jail. I thought that was very interesting. And so many people, after the series came out, they were like, what? They were convinced that that woman was the main character's wife, and they were kind of like, well, what happened to that woman? Why did she fall out of the story? And I immediately thought a piece of the story had just been cut out in production somehow. But you go back and it's like very clear if you're paying incredible amounts of attention to it, which obviously you are if you're the journalist who made the whole thing, right? You've listened to the whole thing so many times. But it was a good lesson to me in that, like, people are definitely paying attention. However, they're not paying as much attention as you are. And maybe sometimes you'll explain something and it will just not be clear. I mentioned it in the email on WhatsApp today in terms of like stories that involve graphs and figures. And this can also be difficult when communicating them in audio. Like if you think about, like, you can put a sidebar in a print piece, you can put them up on screen if it's a visual thing. Even though that's also debatable about how long you put it on screen and how long people need to look at it. But in audio, explaining huge amounts of figures or a graph is difficult. And, you know, some things like emotion are better communicated in audio than in print. Things like graphs, less good. And it kind of feeds into what I was talking about yesterday in terms of like, you need to pick your battles a little bit in terms of a story flourishing in audio. And I think a lot of people now are doing both. They'll write a long piece, maybe like a story, and then they'll produce a podcast series, and they will sort of complement each other. And it's not like you need to consume both to understand the story, but like you'll play your strengths, right? So if something is incredibly figure heavy, you kind of need to work around, like, I don't like the idea of pointing people to, you can suggest figures and I mean, in terms of links and places to go, but like if you ever heard someone read out a link, it's not great on audio. And also, I'm a big fan of, like, and you can put them in the show notes and all that sort of stuff. It's not like you can't do that, but you kind of want people to be able to consume your story without having to like stop their car on the side of the road and click on links in the show notes, right? You're kind of telling a narrative and you don't want to interrupt that. So you might want supplementary information, but you kind of need to figure out how to make this story work without like just reeling off figures everywhere. And we all are creative people. We're all good writers, and we all kind of know how to do that. You just need to work a little bit harder. Like, even if it's a way to explain something in a metaphor or something like that, in order to get your point across. I think we talked a little bit about length yesterday. And I think there is sort of, rough ideas of like 6 episodes is a sweet spot. 30 minutes is another sweet spot in terms of episode length, but you also don't want to waste people's time. I don't want people to feel pressured that they have to fill 6 episodes with a story if 3 episodes would do well, or even 1 episode, right? We're kind of talking in this course about serialized storytelling, and that's a large part of the scripting and all that stuff. But like the worst thing, and I will be honest that like 2-parters do not do well. Like, people don't really respond well to them. That idea is if anyone has seen any of the recent films that are like now going into 2 parts and are like almost cutting in the middle, like I saw one at the weekend, people in the cinema were like pretty upset. That idea that it's like they're okay with 5 episodes, but the idea of two-parter, like a 2-part thing, is like doesn't make people happy. So I would ward against that, but I think a 3-part series is also completely acceptable and like fits in with the structure of beginning, middle, and end really nicely. It helps you kind of orientate that in your mind. Are there any other questions, any other thoughts at this point that anyone wants to say? Okay. You can put them in the chat. You can put them in the chat afterwards, and I will put this call up on YouTube just like yesterday. So that means anyone else can like just view the YouTube video, because I think that's also helpful. I just wanted to talk briefly about today's task, right? So the idea is to script 3 minutes of your series. And some of you might be more familiar with this idea than others, but I think it's kind of great to kind of have the sense of like just freedom to script the first proper scene of the series. Because really what you're doing is you're just sort of combining voiceover with audio clips. That's kind of what scripting is. That's kind of what broadcast editing is. It's simultaneously very complicated in some ways in terms of getting it right, but actually like very simple. Like, it's like bits of ambient sound in terms of background sound, bits of music, bits of talking, bits of voiceover. That's kind of it. So even though it can be very challenging and you can kind of bash your head against the wall getting it right, in terms of being free and kind of thinking about it, scripting the first 3 minutes of your series might be kind of a fun exercise. So I kind of want you to sort of think about this, and obviously it will vary depending on how much you guys have in terms of like actual material for the story you're thinking of. And for this exercise, I just want you to, if you don't have any material, just kind of be free about it. But I think it will kind of help just to think around what a script looks like, right? Like, what a script. I'll post an example of a script in the chat, and maybe that will help you just to see, like, I mean, it will be obvious when you see it, but that idea of a mixture of voiceover and clips and music comes in and that sort of stuff, to get this sense of like being dramatic, to get the sense of like line by line by line. And I can't really stress that enough. This idea of you are building something I wouldn't say one word, but one line at a time, right? And that can be very rewarding, but it can also be quite frustrating. This idea of like, does this line work? Do you need another line in there to explain it? Can that line get taken out? Is it unnecessary? Have you repeated yourself? Those kinds of questions you kind of ask yourself again and again and again. And eventually you'll have that rhythm that will sort of push people through your story, and people will find it quite exciting. But the difference between this kind of storytelling or this kind of audio and like more chat-based stuff is you really are like drilling down to like one line of voiceover. Not everything has to be a line. Like, you don't have to just have one line of voiceover, but I mean, you are thinking about each line as it comes. And you're kind of being sort of critical of if each line needs to be there. And that can be the line of an interview, that can be a line of a voiceover. You don't want this feeling in these kinds of series where the person's just kind of almost left the mic on, and now you've got a big chunk of interview. You know, sometimes that works, especially if you're talking to someone about something very dramatic and very personal. Sometimes that can be very powerful. But let's face it, like behind the scenes, that chunk of very powerful personal interview has definitely been quite heavily edited, right? It's very rare that you're just going to actually use the audio that you've got. You're going to have edited that many times in many different ways. And then the listener kind of feels like, wow, that's like a full minute or 2 minutes of just someone speaking about something very dramatic. But the way you've probably edited it is to give that a sense of drama that wasn't necessarily there. Because I mean, as we know from hearing people speak all day, people don't speak in the sound bites and the dramatic phrasing and tell the stories well enough compared to what we want them to appear as in audio, right? And that's kind of our jobs. Like, that's kind of why we're here, is to kind of make that more dramatic and make that better on the ear. So that's the task for tomorrow. Please feel free to either drop them in the chat. If you want other people to see them and share them, you can drop them directly to me on WhatsApp, or you can email me directly as well. Just to kind of, and I'm happy to give feedback on anything you send if it's either, and if you haven't done yesterday's task, you can also do that and send that through. I'll also take a look at that. Are there any other questions or thoughts or comments or anything anyone wants to say at this point? No? Okay, great. Thank you very much, everyone.
I'll have
I will see you tomorrow. And I'll put this YouTube link as well. If you guys haven't managed to pick up on what I've been saying, you want to re-listen to it, I'll put that on YouTube as well. And I'll see you guys tomorrow. Catch you later.